Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Judith Roberts was just 14 years old when she went out for a bike ride after school one day, only to be later found brutally murdered. A teenage boy would be arrested and convicted of the crime. But had they got the right man? Here is the story of Judith Roberts and Andrew Evans. "14-year-old Judith Roberts was described as a shy yet mischievous girl, a personality which reflected in her features, with her cheeky smile, doe-like eyes, and her dark hair styled into a pixie cut. The daughter of a schoolteacher, Judith was academically gifted and proved to be a popular pupil at the Queen Elizabeth Grammar School in Tamworth, which she attended with her twin sister Anne, and where her father, Vincent, worked. Judith lived with her twin sister and her two younger siblings, Nicola and Rebecca, in the village of Wigington, which lies roughly 11 miles away from the city of Birmingham. The quiet hamlet, with its country lanes lined with hawthorn hedges and vast acres of farmland, was an idyllic place to grow up, with children exploring the woodlands and playing in the fields. The passing of winter made way for the emergence of spring. The green pastures were filled with the sounds of newborn lambs, and birdsong drifted on the soft breeze that gently moved through the wildflower meadows, carrying the wonderful scent of the season. It was during this splendid spring, on the 7th of June, the twins arrived home from school. Anne headed off upstairs to start her homework, while Judith waited for her so they could go on their usual bike ride. What made the 14-year-old leave her home without her twin sister varies depending on the source, with some stating Judith had argued with her parents because she was wearing makeup, while others suggest it was a row over her diet, and some claim that she just wanted to go out on her bike and had got fed up of waiting for her sister to join her. Anne, however, told newspapers that we used to go before settling down to do our homework, or after we had finished it. It was a nice evening on Wednesday, but I had some homework to finish and Judith went without me. Regardless of what caused her to leave the home, Judith set off at about 5:30 on her green bike, with a blue coat pulled over her blue and white checkered school dress. She calmly rode away from her semi-detached home on Gilway Lane in the direction of the country lanes that she loved to traverse with her sister. As the chilled air of dusk descended over the quiet hamlet, the sounds of voices echoed over the fields. News had spread swiftly that Judith had failed to return home, and as darkness began to gather on the horizon, fears for her safety intensified. Those secluded country lanes that seemed so inviting in the sunlight were now being consumed by shadows. The towering hedgerows and ditches that lined them now appeared like potential traps into which the teenager may be lying injured. 3 desperate days search parties scoured the area. Locals and the police were aided by soldiers from Whittington Barracks, which lay just 9 miles away from Judith's last known location. Over 3 agonizing and sleepless nights, Judith's family waited for news, hoping that their daughter would be found safe, that she had simply fallen from her bike and was lying injured somewhere. But as the hours ticked by, hopes turned to fears, and on the 3rd day, those dark thoughts that they had been fighting became a reality, when Mr. and Mrs. Roberts were informed that a body had been found. People in the village were already becoming aware of the new development, as flares had been set off to alert police to the discovery, followed by a hive of activity by a hedgerow that separated a field from Wigington Lane, less than 3,000 feet away from Judith's home. The teenager's body had been concealed underneath some garden waste, with only a pale hand visible. Her beloved bag had been discarded nearby. As the plastic bags, grass cuttings and other waste was removed, Judith's lifeless body emerged. She lay face down with her lower half undressed, and her dress pulled up above her waist. However, it was initially believed that the teenager had not been sexually assaulted. A subsequent post-mortem would determine that Judith had died not long after she had left her home. She had endured 19 injuries primarily to her head and neck, with the pathologist surmising that the first impact had been to the back of the skull, and that given the projected angle of the blow, she had been standing when she was struck. This rendered her unconscious, and the remaining injuries were inflicted while she lay on the ground. Given this information, investigators began to work on the theory that the girl had been forced from her bike, and her attacker had then dragged her into the field, where she was later found. During the initial search of the crime scene, a piece of asbestos sheeting was discovered on which they found bloodstains, leading to the conclusion that this was probably what had been used to inflict Judith's injuries. Eager to apprehend the killer as soon as possible, a massive investigation was launched, during which about 200 detectives were brought in to assist in collating witness statements, conduct door-to-door inquiries, and gather fingerprints. Thousands of pieces of information were gathered, each having to be meticulously checked, and a determination made as to whether it was pertinent to the case. Numerous appeals were made over the weeks following the murder, with Detective Chief Superintendent Harold Wright urging potential witnesses to come forward. During one press conference, he requested that any couples who had been using the non-lovers lane in the area should come forward with any information, with the detective stating, "We are not bothered with what they were doing there. We want to know what they saw. Anyone who noticed any suspicious behaviour or had been approached, assaulted, or followed in recent months needs to come forward." Early statements from witnesses suggested that Judith may have been in the company of a man, whose description was released to the public in the hopes that someone would be able to identify him. The witness had stated that the man and the girl had been in the vicinity of the murder scene between 5:30 and 6:30, and that this man appeared to be in his 30s, approximately 6 foot tall, with a stocky build, and had the appearance of someone who worked or spent a lot of time outdoors. The witness went on to describe that the man's clothing, weathered complexion and Wellington boots made them come to this conclusion. What made this statement significant to the investigation was the description of the young girl, who the witness claimed was wearing a blue and white school uniform and was pushing a bike as she walked alongside the unknown male. Further information suggested to police that this individual either lived locally or he had an in-depth knowledge of the area. Detective Wright advised the press that they were optimistic about the information, but he cautioned, quote, "If the sighting was at 5:30 p.m, the girl could not have been Judith, because we know she was at home at that time. But if it was at 8:30 p.m, then it could have been Judith, and the man with her could have been her killer." Alongside the description, 3 photographs were released of men who were in the vicinity of the crime scene at the time of the murder, with the police requesting that these individuals made themselves known to the police. An appeal was also issued for drivers of several cars that had been observed in the area on the night of the murder to come forward and provide a statement and fingerprints in order to rule them out as suspects. Donald Saunders, who was the detective leading the operation for Scotland Yard, issued a statement in which he listed the cars he wanted to identify, stating, quote, "We have traced most of the people and vehicles using Comberford Lane at Wigington on the evening of June the 7th, when Judith was killed. But the 6 vehicles in question have not yet been traced, and we earnestly ask the drivers and passengers to come forward and provide us with any information that may be vital to our inquiries." He proceeded to list the vehicles in question as a blue Ford Cortina car in dirty condition seen parked in the lane between 5:15 p.m. and 8 p.m, a white-coloured car, possibly a Triumph, seen in the lane at about 5:50 p.m, a dark red car parked between 6:45 p.m. and 7:15 p.m. in the entrance to the field where Judith's battered body was found, a blue or grey Ford Escort parked in the lane at 8:55 p.m, a pale blue van seen in the lane at 7:55 p.m, and a green mini car in the lane at 8 p.m. A month after Judith's murder, it was reported that there had been a number of attacks 23 miles south of Tamworth in the Chelmsley Wood area on the outskirts of Birmingham. The police were eager to trace the man involved in these incidents, during which he had caught frightened women over the last 7 months. He has not hurt anyone the last few months, and seems to be more of a nuisance than a danger, stated officers. Although investigators proceeded to advise that they believed the incidents were unrelated to Judith's murder, it was still a line of inquiry that they needed to follow up. They also looked into the assault of a 9-year-old girl, which had occurred 9 miles away from the town of Brown Hills, and issued a description of a person of interest, who was described as being a man in his 40s or 50s, wearing a grey suit, riding a black bicycle near to the place where the attack occurred. There were also concerns regarding reports of men driving around the Tamworth area trying to coax primarily schoolgirls between the age of 14 and 15 into their vehicles. Detective Saunders commented on this, quote, "I am not being an alarmist, but this is causing us very great concern." The officer proceeded to urge parents to ensure their children are aware of the dangers of accepting a ride from strangers, and that any incidents should be reported as soon as possible. The conclusion of these inquiries did not bring them closer to catching Judith's killer, with Detective Saunders reflecting that, quote, "We were obviously interested in the Chelmsley Wood incidents because they are so close to this area, but following our talks, we do not think there are any connections. We are now checking through the files of unsolved murder cases of a similar nature which had taken place in different parts of the country over the last 10 to 15 years. To help generate further leads, the decision was made to stage a reconstruction of Judith's last known movements. Commenting on this decision, Detective Chief Superintendent Donald Saunders from Scotland Yard stated, "We will be using at least a dozen witnesses and also vehicles. This reconstruction will be of great value and will also help us test some of our deductions. The exercise will take place in Comberford Lane, Wigington, where 14-year-old Judith's body was found 10 weeks ago." In what can only be described as a harrowing experience, Judith's twin sister Anne agreed to take part in the reconstruction, during which she wore a school uniform identical to that worn by her sister, and she was shown riding the same green bicycle. Those who witnessed the reconstruction observed the nervous 14-year-old, who appeared pale and sickly, travel the 2 miles between her home and the spot where her twin sister Judith's body was found. Anne was escorted along the route by numerous police vehicles and was observed leaving the Roberts household at 6 o'clock, from where the teenager made her way along the route that had been pieced together using witness testimony. They were able to trace Judith's journey through the various country lanes, which led to a sweet shop, after which the teenager had headed back towards her home along the same roads, until she came to Comberford Lane, and the place where her sister died. Following this, Anne found herself bombarded by photographers and reporters who were advised that the teenager would not be answering any questions. It was Detective Saunders who commented on the family's willingness to participate in the reconstruction, quote, "The whole family agreed to this exercise. Otherwise, we would not have attempted to mount it. We are extremely grateful to Anne." The possibility of the perpetrator being someone who was known to Judith was also explored, with investigators speaking to pupils from Judith's school. The teenager's diary was also examined by Scotland Yard for clues as to whether she had a secret boyfriend or mentioned a name that could be followed up on, but the teenager's writings did not help lead the police to her killer. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the receipt of a letter by a local newspaper claiming to be the perpetrator. The correspondence was created using words cut out of newspaper articles, and the author claimed that, quote, "I'll kill again. Litchfield schoolgirl dies next at weekend." The letter was signed, "The Tamworth Murderer." As the weeks passed into months, investigators were no closer to finding Judith's killer. That was until 3 months after the murder, when a young man entered the police station. As he walked into the foyer of the station, his hands were shaking with nerves. Beads of perspiration formed upon his brow, and his voice quivered as he spoke to the desk sergeant, advising he needed to speak to someone about a murder. Concealed beneath thick black hair, his eyes peered out from heavy-rimmed glasses, as he was led to a private room. The boy was 17 years old, yet he appeared like a child who had just been sent to the head teacher's office. When he was joined by the detective, the teenager began to speak. He asked to see a picture of the girl whose murder they were investigating, stating he believed he was responsible for her death, but he couldn't remember. All he knows is that her face haunts his dreams. He described how, quote, "I keep seeing her face. I want to see a picture of her. I wonder if I've done it." Investigators asked if he had been in the Tamworth area at the time of the murder, to which he replied, "I don't know. I could have been. I forget where I've been. I don't know. Show me a picture and I'll tell you if I've seen it." Officers were initially perplexed by this individual's claims, and wondered whether he was genuinely responsible for the crime, or was he someone who was unwell, and it was his illness that caused him to believe that he had murdered Judith. 3 days after 17-year-old Andrew Evans had entered the police station, the investigation took a turn when he was arrested for the murder. After providing police with a full confession, the relief of knowing that the perpetrator had been caught was palpable in the village and its surrounding areas. The residents eagerly awaited the results of the trial, which began at Birmingham Crown Court on Wednesday the 4th of April, 1973. On the first day of the trial, the opposing counsels presented their opening statements, with the prosecutor, Mr. Brian Gibbons, QC, suggesting that the details disclosed in Evans's confession were not public knowledge and contained information that only the killer would know. Meanwhile, Mr. John Owens, for the defence, placed the onus on the prosecution to prove that the confession was completely truthful, and wasn't just the words of a frightened and vulnerable young man. And it was their responsibility to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the man sat in the dock had really killed Judith Roberts. Mr. Owens continued by stating, quote, "In many cases, it is perhaps the last resort of a man who is accused to say, 'Well, you prove it.' You may think it would be wrong to take such a view about Andrew Evans." The defence proceeded to present 2 alternative scenarios, one being that Evans was the killer, but highlighted that there is nothing about his confession to corroborate this. The second option for the jury to consider was that Evans had been a witness to the crime, suggesting that what he saw had caused him to be so traumatised, and this had affected his recollection of what had occurred. Owens pointed at the defendant and stated, quote, "He will tell you that he is quite satisfied that he did not murder this girl, and one of the reasons is that he does not feel like a murderer." On the 3rd day of the trial, written testimony was presented on behalf of Evans's grandmother, in which she told the court that, quote, "Andrew used to look at the papers, but only at the stars, the cartoon, and the picture of the dead girl." Mr. Owen for the defence then requested that the defendant's mother, Mrs. Joan Evans, take to the stand. When asked about her son, she advised that he had been diagnosed with asthma at the age of 4, and this affected her son, continuing, quote, "As a child, he always wanted to do the same thing as other children. I had to constantly tell him that he could not do this or that. If he tried to do these things, he became wheezy and had to be given injections. As he grew older, these attacks became less frequent, but he still could not do physical education as he would like to have done. I think he wanted to be the same as everyone else, but I did not want him to go back." During her testimony, she explained that it was the asthma which had resulted in Evans being discharged from the army, saying that she was only aware of her son's collapse 2, possibly 3 weeks prior to him being discharged, when he wrote to her from hospital explaining that he had had an attack during a training run. On the day he returned home after being discharged from the army, she noticed no change in her son's demeanour. He told his mother that he had planned to stay at his grandmother's house in Longton, and that he already had his clothes there. She advised that his father, who was away at work, may not agree to that, and Andrew replied that if his father disagreed, he would return home. Mrs. Evans concluded her testimony by referring to her son's character, advising that he is not aggressive, violent, or mean-spirited. Detectives who had worked on the case provided statements pertaining to the investigation, describing how they utilised the media and performed a reconstruction of the events leading up to the murder, with them confirming that certain details, such as Judith's exact injuries and the location of her bike, were kept from the media, meaning that information would only be known by the killer. When asked about his interviews with Evans, DCI Stanley Wood told the court that the defendant had stated, quote, "I don't know why I killed her. I was there, and I did some of these things. I remember picking up something round. I got my hand 3/4 the way around it, and I hit her with it." Another officer, D.S. Reader, recollected a visit between the defendant and his mother, to whom he confessed his crime. During the conversation between mother and son, D.S. Reader claimed that Evans stated that he didn't feel any guilt or remorse about what he had done, but he was sorry he had hurt his mother. Evans also stated, quote, "If they kept me in the army, this might not have happened. I liked the army and could have made a good go of it. It was hard, but I could do it. I enjoyed it. If I'd not tried so hard, I might have stayed. I worked too hard, and that is why I had the asthma attack." DCS Saunders, who had led the investigation, took to the stand and stated that throughout his interactions with Evans, he found the defendant to be, quote, "very calm indeed, answering questions in a considered manner. He would think about what he was asked and was giving answers with due consideration. My impression was that he was giving answers that were truthful, and that he was giving us his recollection of the events that happened in June." He continued to explain that at no point during the interviews was the defendant shown an image of Judith, further adding that when they took Evans to the crime scene, the defendant was able to lead them to the field and identify the spot where Judith's body had been found, and the position she had been lying in, details that had been withheld from the press. The detective recollected how Evans was able to provide details regarding what had happened to Judith. He was able to advise interviewers on whether the teenager had been sexually assaulted, as well as the clothing and jewellery the victim had been wearing. Delving further into the investigation, Detective Saunders admitted that prior to Evans coming forward, they had identified a potential suspect, whom was referred to in court as Mr. X. When questioned by the defence lawyer, Mr. Owen, on who this individual was, Detective Saunders explained that he was the son of a local farmer who had been brought in for questioning, during which Mr. X denied having any involvement in Judith's death. However, it was noted that his account of his movements on the day of the murder were inconsistent. When asked if there was any evidence that could have connected Mr. X to the murder, the court heard that traces of blood found on Mr. X's clothing matched both Judith's and Mr. X's blood type. Therefore, this could not provide concrete proof of his involvement. Detective Saunders concluded by stating, "There was no evidence we had to suspect he had anything to do with that offence. There was no evidence that he had lied, and there was also inconsistencies in Evans's story." The key point of the trial came when Andrew Evans was called to the witness box, where he was initially questioned by his defence lawyer, Mr. Owen, who asked, quote, "Is there anything which has been produced in the evidence for the prosecution which has brought to your memory a feeling that you might have killed this girl?" To which Evans responded, "No, quite the contrary, in fact. I now know that I have not done it." Mr. Owens then asked the defendant to provide an account of what he had done on the day of the murder, to which Evans recalled that nothing particular occurred that day. He insisted that he did not leave the army barracks that day. He stated that after dinner, while the others went to exercise, he remained in his bunk, and didn't leave it till about 2:30 p.m, when he headed off to the naffy, where he had something to eat. He then claimed that he had returned to the naffy at about 6:30 to watch television, which, if true, meant that he was not in the Tamworth area at the time of the murder. However, his memory was not completely trustworthy, as Evans claimed that he had been seen by another individual that day. Unfortunately, this person was unable to corroborate his story. When asked why this might be, Evans suggested that perhaps he had got his days confused. Mr. Owen moved the questioning on to the murder, asking Evans, quote, "Had you ever worried about this girl?" Evans replied, "No." Mr. Owen probed further. "Had you got anything to be worried about at the time?" Evans stated, "When the first policeman came, I was worried about getting a job, and that was all." The defence lawyer then asked Evans if he had been aware of any of the media coverage of the case, in which the teenage boy stated that he had remembered, quote, "There was this girl, it was her sister as I know now, they did a sort of mock-up of it." Following this line of questioning, the proceedings were continued the following day, with Evans returning once more to the stand to testify. The defence began the day by exploring the fact that Evans was given drugs to help him remember what had happened when Judith was murdered. Evans told the court that he had requested that he be administered the drugs because he hoped it would improve his memory. He continued to state that he was given the drugs on 3 occasions during his interviews with the police. When asked what had prompted him to go to the police station, Andrew replied that following a visit to his home by officers investigating the murder, he was unable to sleep because he was worried and was trying to recall what he had been doing on the day of the murder. He fell asleep with these worries and, quote, "I remember waking up during the night, dreaming of a face. It was the face of a girl. I cannot describe it." It was after this dream that he decided to go to the police, and he stated he was shown a picture of Judith prior to him being administered the drugs. He proceeded by explaining that he remembered confessing to the murder, and continued to describe what he remembered about the murder, stating, quote, "All I have now is a recollection of a girl's legs in a field. The legs were sticking up from her body. I am leaning up against a gate and looking into a field. On the other side of the field is a person standing up. Below him and right against this person, there are a girl's legs sticking out. One leg is bridged and the other is straight out." During cross-examination, prosecutor Mr. Gibbons aimed to highlight the contradiction in the defendant's claims that he could remember making the confession, but now claims not to be guilty of the crime, asking, quote, "Are you trying to say that you don't remember anything now, but you did at the time?" Evans responded, "I don't think I'm trying to forget, but I can't remember." Mr. Gibbons continued to pick holes in Evans's claims, stating, "Either you were telling the truth at the time, or this was a great work of fiction, down to the smallest detail." To emphasize this point, the prosecutor read a segment from the police interview, quote, "I put the clothes under the head. Before I hit the body, there was something lying across the body. It was like I said, and like I have drawn." He then asked the defendant, what was lying across the body? Evans responded that he didn't recall, and again, Mr. Gibbons inquired why the defendant was unable to remember that detail, yet he knew something was lying across the girl's body. The teenager proceeded to insist that at the time he thought what he confessed to was true. But he did not trust his memory, but he was certain that he would not have raped the girl. The prosecution continued to attempt to discredit Evans's claims. I proceeded to read another extract from his police statement, quote, "She had a very dark mark on her face where I struck her." The prosecutor asked Evans, "Something must have made you very angry to hit this girl like that. Was it true?" Evans replied, "I was only trying to think at the time." At the closing of the prosecution's questioning, Judge Crichton inquired why Evans believed he had killed Judith. The defendant replied, "It was the only logical assumption, because I had these facts in my head." Focus then turned to expert testimony on the possible causes of Evans' memory loss, with Dr. Anton Stevens being called to the stand by the defence. The doctor advised that he had examined Evans when he was in police custody, and determined that the defendant had no recollection of the murder. He proceeded to explain the possible reasons for this condition, quote, "There could be 2. Either the defendant did kill Judith Roberts, or he witnessed the killings and the events connected with it, and that in itself was sufficient to shock and to cause this memory suppression." With regards to what was termed as truth drugs, the doctor stated that the medication would not have prevented the defendant from lying, to which Mr. Owens questioned whether the doctor thought Evans was lying. Dr. Stevens responded, quote, "I think that had there been a conscious, deliberate lying, it would have been a much better attempt. He has a great facility to create fantasies. He then cannot distinguish between the fantasy he has made and the bedrock of fact that it was based on." The doctor was then asked whether he believed Evans had killed Judith, or had he been a witness who had been traumatized by the events, to which Dr. Stevens replied, quote, "If these things are equally balanced in truth, I would say the second is most likely." Dr. Reginald Washbrook, who was the medical officer at the prison where Evans was held on remand, stated that he found Evans to be an immature and hysterical individual, continuing to explain, quote, "By hysterical I mean a person who tends to use his imagination a little more than the so-called average among us. All of us have an element of hysteria in our nature, and he has a little more drama in his makeup." Dr. Washbrook continued to advise that having assessed Evans, he believed that the teenager's confession was, quote, "a genuine picture of what was in his mind at the time." The doctor would not go so far as to state whether the defendant's statement had been truthful. The prosecution then proceeded to cross-examine the witness, with Mr. Gibbons asking, quote, "Was it your opinion yesterday that the fact the defendant had said he was at the scene and not in the barracks would be remembered by him when he was giving evidence?" Washbrook responded, "Yes." Mr. Gibbons then inquired, "Was it further your opinion that when in the witness box he said that he was not at the scene but in the barracks, he was consciously changing his story?" To which the doctor responded, "When you put it to me that way, I have to say yes." With the conclusion of Dr. Washbrook's testimony, the trial came to a close, with the jury being sent out to deliberate the verdict. Despite Andrew Evans retracting his confession, proclaiming his innocence and the lack of evidence linking him to the crime, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, resulting in the then 18-year-old being sentenced to life in prison. Here is usually where the story ends, with a conviction being secured and justice being served. However, this was not the case. Evans continued to insist that he had not murdered Judith Roberts. When he was advised that he would not be able to appeal his sentence, the teenager resigned himself to the fact that he was going to spend the rest of his life behind bars. This was until his story began to attract attention. And following a correspondence sent by Evans in 1994 to the human rights organisation Justice, he found they were willing to advocate for his freedom, and over the next 3 years they fought for his appeal. The fight for his appeal gained momentum. In December 1997, 25 years after the crime that had sent him to prison, Andrew Evans's case would be presented to the appeals court, with proceedings presided over by Lord Chief Justice Lord Bingham, Mr. Justice Jarrett, and Mr. Justice Douglas Brown. During the hearing, the mental state of the defendant was discussed in great detail, with it being revealed that he had been treated for depression at the time of the murder, and that he was not able to take his medication during the many hours of police questioning. The handling of these interviews were also criticised, as the teenager was not advised that he could have his parents or a legal representative, nor was he cautioned. Evans's lawyer at the appeal, Patrick O'Connor, argued that had his client had someone there with him during the interviews, his confession either would not have been made or would not have been accepted, as Evans would have been deemed unfit for interview. This was further expanded upon when the judges reflected that the psychiatric testimony submitted during the trial was not reliable. A doctor also advised the appeal hearing that he believed that Evans was under extreme stress during the police interviews, which had been exacerbated by the situation he was confronted with. The doctor argued that this set of circumstances could have led to Evans developing false memories. Given the diagnosis, the doctor concluded that if the case had been tried in 1997, Evans's confession would not have been admissible in court. Lord Bingham directed attention to Evans's plea statement, stating, quote, "In this he clearly implicated himself as the murderer. Many of the details in this statement accorded with the facts as then known or later established, but some did not." Turning to the evidence presented in the original trial, it was argued that apart from the confession, which by 1997 legal standards would not have been allowed, there was very little evidence to connect Evans to the crime. No trace of Judith's blood or hair was found or anything associated with Evans. Nor were there any traces of him being in contact with her. It was also revealed that a fingerprint that had been recovered from Judith's bike did not match the defendant's. Given the lack of physical evidence and the nature through which the confession was obtained, the Court of Appeal declared that the conviction was not safe and ordered that Andrew Evans should be released from prison. In 1973, a shy, socially awkward 17-year-old boy was arrested and later convicted of murder. He faced spending the rest of his life behind bars. In 1997, a 41-year-old man had his first taste of freedom in 25 years. Entering a world that had changed beyond recognition, the places and people he once knew had aged, moved on, or simply disappeared. For Evans, being given his freedom was both a blessing and a curse. He has required hundreds of hours of counselling to help him to adjust to life outside of prison. He suffers from anxiety and has flashbacks of his time behind bars and the brutal things he experienced. In a candid interview with Ross Dodd at the Birmingham Post in June 2000, Evans described how his life has changed since his release, including the fact that he has found love and a family with his wife Sue and her daughter from a previous relationship. He also explained that the compensation he had received, totalling almost £1 million, will help him and his family to have a fresh start after he'd spent the initial years since his release renting properties and not feeling like he really belonged anywhere. But he added that the money will not make up for the years he has lost, the memories he's missed out on, and the goodbyes he couldn't say. Evans also told Ross Dodd about his feelings when he first left prison, stating, quote, "Loneliness was the first thing that hit me. I realised something of the world had gone by, and that I was out of step." Everything has changed for Andrew, including his relationship with his family, explaining to Ross Dodd, quote, "My parents and sisters loved me so much, but I was on another planet. I'd been swimming in dirty water for 25 years, and the only way to deal with that is to become part of it. Whether you like it or not, it hurt me to see the hurt in my family's eyes. And I was a stranger to them. They came to visit me in jail, but just as you started to relax with each other, it would be time for them to go. So although I visited them regularly when I was freed, I didn't go and live with them." The interview concluded with Andrew admitting that, quote, "The horror of what has happened to me doesn't go away, but now I have a new life, a life I would never have had if I had not met Sue. No way in this world did I think I'd be so happy." It has now been almost 50 years since 14-year-old Judith Roberts left her family home for just an evening bike ride, for her to later be found murdered just off a secluded country lane. For 24 years, it was believed that the right person had been convicted and was serving time for the crime. But he walked free, and the true perpetrator has never been identified. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. Join me next time for more It's Murder Up North. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.